I'm Edward, glad to have your company this evening. A heartfelt greeting tonight to our listeners in New Jersey. If you're enjoying these cozy tales, they are now available on Spotify as well. You'll find the link in the description. Now, let the story unfold. Chapter 1. The Guest List, written in a steady hand. The last days of October brought to St. Mary Mead that particular quality of stillness, which belongs only to the turning of the year. The summer's long, unhurried conversations had drawn to their natural close, the garden paths had grown damp underfoot, and the hours of daylight, once so generously extended, now contracted with a firmness that left little room for debate. Fires were lit earlier, curtains were drawn sooner, and the village, which had always possessed a gift for quiet self-containment, settled into itself with the ease of long habit. It was on one such afternoon, cool and grey and faintly fragrant with leaf mould, that Miss Jane Marple sat at the table beside her sitting-room window and attended to her correspondence. She was not by any outward measure a remarkable figure. She was elderly, slight, and white-haired, with the composed and patient expression of a woman who had learned, through many years of careful observation, that the world seldom failed to reveal itself in the end. Her movements were deliberate and unhurried, and her thoughts, when they turned from her letters to the street beyond the glass, were those of a person who found the ordinary world a source of considerable interest. King St. Mary Mead spread itself out before her with its familiar arrangement of cottages, hedgerows, and modest gardens. A boy on a bicycle passed along the lane. Mrs. Prentice could be seen at her gate, engaged in a conversation that appeared mildly animated. The church tower stood as it always had, composed and grey against the pale autumn sky. There was nothing, to any casual observer, which would have distinguished that afternoon from 100 others. Miss Marple, however, was not a casual observer, and she had noticed something which, though small in itself, had lodged itself in her mind with the quiet persistence of a splinter. She had received that morning a brief visit from her neighbour, Mrs. Hartwell, who had mentioned in passing that Mrs. Eleanor Finch of Longridge House was preparing a small supper gathering for the following week. This was not in itself unusual. Mrs. Finch was a sociable woman of 60 or thereabouts, well established in village life, and her house, a substantial property at the quieter end of Maple Lane, with an orchard running along its eastern boundary, had seen its share of dinner parties and afternoon gatherings over the years. What had given Miss Marple pause was a detail Mrs. Hartwell had offered without particular emphasis, as one might offer a passing remark about the weather. Mrs. Finch, she said, had written out her invitations by hand. A list, it appeared, had been prepared with considerable care. Each name had been selected, and the selection, from what Mrs. Hartwell could gather, was not the ordinary assembling of one's nearest acquaintances for an evening of pleasant company. Rather, it seemed that each guest had been chosen with a quiet deliberateness that was, in Mrs. Hartwell's words, rather particular for Eleanor. Miss Marple had said very little in response. She had offered a small smile and agreed that Mrs. Finch always took great pains with her arrangements, but the remark had remained with her, and she had found herself returning to it with the thoughtful attention one gives to a thing which does not quite fit its surroundings. A guest list written with deliberate care was, of course, entirely unremarkable in isolation. People were selective about their company. That was natural and proper. But there was something in the quality of Mrs. Hartwell's description, the slight elevation of the eyebrows, the brief hesitation before rather particular, which suggested that the selection had been noticed even by those not invited to make sense of it. Miss Marple set down her pen and folded her hands in her lap. She thought, as she often did in such moments, of parallels from village life. There had been, many years ago, a woman in the village of Barton Cross who had assembled a very similar gathering on the occasion of a disputed inheritance, each person present holding some piece of knowledge, some connection to the matter, which the hostess had clearly wished to manage within the compass of a single room. The gathering had appeared entirely social. The conversation had been pleasant, and yet, by the end of the evening, certain things had been said, and certain silences had been observed, which had served the hostess's purposes admirably. Whether Mrs. Finch's gathering bore any resemblance to that occasion, Miss Marple could not say. She was not in the habit of assuming the worst of her neighbours, but she was equally not in the habit of ignoring the small, insistent weight of a detail that did not quite sit still. The guests, as Mrs. Hartwell had gathered, included Mr. Arthur Pell, who had lived for some years in the village and occupied a modest house near the old mill. Mr. Pell was a man of perhaps 55, quietly dressed, civil in manner, and possessed of an air of mild self-containment that made him difficult to know with any precision. He had come to St. Mary Mead from somewhere to the north, one of the larger towns, or it was thought, and had settled with the ease of a man who had made a conscious decision to reduce the scale of his life. He was not unfriendly, but neither was he forthcoming. He attended church on the principal occasions, contributed to the village fete in a moderate and unobtrusive fashion, and was generally regarded as a perfectly agreeable neighbour who had, nonetheless, remained something of a stranger. Also invited, as far as Mrs. Hartwell had been able to determine, were Mr. and Mrs. Gerald Compton, who had lived at the old rectory cottage for the better part of a decade. Mr. Compton was a retired solicitor, with a dry and careful manner of speaking, and a habit of listening to others with an expression of polite scepticism that many found faintly unsettling. His wife, Marian, was considerably more at ease in company, with a warmth of manner and a ready laugh, though those who knew her well had observed that her ease was the ease of a woman who had learned, over many years, to cover a good deal of ground smoothly. They were a couple who complemented one another in the way that long-married pairs often do, each supplying what the other lacked, and each, by that arrangement, making the whole somewhat harder to read. There was additionally Miss Clara Holt, who taught the younger children at the village school and lived in a small house on the other side of the lane from the church. Miss Holt was perhaps 40, spare and precise in her habits, with a manner that was forthright without being unkind. She had known Mrs. Finch for many years, and was generally regarded as a steady and reliable woman, with no great fondness for complication. Her presence at the gathering did not surprise Miss Marple particularly, though she noted it. The final name Mrs. Hartwell had mentioned was that of Mr. Douglas Weatherby, a man of around 50, who had moved to St. Mary Mead some 3 years earlier following, it was understood, a period of some difficulty in his business affairs. He had taken a house on the far side of the village green, and had since occupied himself with a small amount of quiet consultancy work, the nature of which was not entirely clear to his neighbours. He was affable and presentable, always well turned out, always ready with a pleasant word, and always, Miss Marple had privately observed, rather more comfortable with the surface of things than with anything deeper. 5 guests then, beside the hostess. 6 people, gathered in the late October at Longridge House, sick, with its quiet rooms and its orchard path beyond the garden gate. Miss Marple turned this arrangement over in her mind with the careful, unhurried attention she brought to all such things. Each name, as she considered it, carried its own small weight. There was something she felt in the particular combination: the retired solicitor and his adaptable wife, the practical school-teacher, the amiable man with the uncertain past, and the quietly self-contained Mr. Pell, which suggested not merely a social occasion, but something that required each of those specific individuals to be present, not others, these. It was the kind of thought one could dismiss easily enough, and Miss Marple was quite aware of that. She was an old woman sitting by a window on an October afternoon, forming impressions from the casual observations of a neighbour. There was no more to it than that. Very likely the evening would pass pleasantly, the supper would be agreeable, and the whole occasion would leave behind no impression more lasting than a mild satisfaction on Mrs. Finch's part, and a polite gratitude on that of her guests. And yet... Miss Marple reached forward and took up her pen once more. She returned to her correspondence with a steady hand, and wrote 2 careful paragraphs before setting the pen down again. Outside, the light was shifting, the pale afternoon beginning its early retreat. The boy on the bicycle had gone. Mrs. Prentice had returned indoors. The lane was quiet. She sat for a moment in the stillness of her sitting room, one hand resting on the arm of her chair, and considered that she would perhaps call on Mrs. Finch in the next day or two, not for any particular reason, simply to inquire after her health as one did, and if the occasion arose naturally, to hear a little more about the gathering at Longridge House. There was nothing amiss, she told herself, very likely nothing at all, but a guest list written with deliberate care in a steady hand by a woman not generally given to deliberate care. That was the sort of detail which, in Miss Marple's long experience, had a way of meaning something. She was not yet certain what, but she thought she would like, when the time came, to be paying attention. Denna Chapter 2. The lamps lit before the curtains were drawn. Miss Marple did, in the end, call upon Mrs. Eleanor Finch, and she did so on the Thursday afternoon preceding the gathering, which was itself arranged for the following Tuesday. She brought with her a small pot of preserved plum, as one did when calling upon a neighbour without a particular pretext, and she arrived at Longridge House at 3:30, when the light was still sufficient to see the garden clearly, and the cold had not yet settled into the kind of damp insistence that made visits unwelcome. Mrs. Finch received her in the sitting-room, which was a pleasant, well-proportioned space with a fire already lit, and a collection of small watercolours arranged on the wall above the mantelpiece. She was a woman who carried her age comfortably, either with grey hair set in a manner that was tidy without being severe, and eyes of a clear, pale blue that gave her face an expression of steady composure. She thanked Miss Marple for the plum preserve with genuine warmth, and set it on the side table with the careful regard one gives to a small gift from a person one genuinely respects. They spoke of ordinary things to begin with, as one does: the shortening of the days, the condition of the lane after the recent rain, the question of whether old Mr. Pierce's apple trees had produced well this season, given the indifferent summer. Mrs. Finch poured the tea with the ease of a woman quite accustomed to managing her own household, and Miss Marple accepted her cup and settled herself comfortably into the chair beside the fire, Elas on hand resting on her knitting bag in the restful manner she had long cultivated. It was not until the second cup that the gathering was mentioned at all, and it was Mrs. Finch who introduced the subject, which Miss Marple had thought likely. There was a quality in the way she raised it, a slight deliberateness, a small clearing of tone, which suggested that she had been considering how to introduce it for some little time. "I'm having a few people to supper on Tuesday," Mrs. Finch said, setting down the teapot with care. "A small group, nothing elaborate." "How very pleasant," said Miss Marple. "The evenings do rather call for company at this time of year." Mrs. Finch agreed that they did. She named her guests in a manner that was orderly without being quite list-like, as though she had composed the recitation beforehand. Mr. and Mrs. Compton, Miss Holt, Mr. Weatherby, and Mr. Pell. Miss Marple received each name with an expression of mild interest, and said nothing beyond the small affirmations that polite attention requires. She noted, however, that Mrs. Finch spoke the names in the manner of a person accounting for something, rather than simply describing a social occasion. There was no excess of enthusiasm, no particular warmth attached to any one name over another. They were offered, each in turn, with the measured evenness of a woman who wished to appear perfectly at ease, and had therefore been rather too careful about it. "I have always found Mr. Pell very pleasant company," Miss Marple said, after a brief pause. "He has lived here quite some years now, has he not?" "He has," said Mrs. Finch. "Since the spring of 1934, I believe. He came from Harrogate originally, or thereabouts." "He keeps rather to himself," Miss Marple observed, with the mild, uncritical tone of someone noting the weather. "He does," said Mrs. Finch. And then, after the smallest of hesitations, "He is a man who has found the village suits him, I think. The quiet of it." There was something in the way she said this, a slight evenness, a deliberate absence of elaboration, that Miss Marple found more informative than a longer explanation would have been. She nodded and took a sip of her tea and allowed the subject to rest exactly where Mrs. Finch had set it down. She did not press for more. It was not her habit to press. One learned considerably more by remaining still. On the evening of the gathering itself, Miss Marple was not present, which was entirely proper. She had not been invited, and she would not have expected to be. But she was, as it happened, in a position to observe the house from a distance, having undertaken a short walk along Maple Lane at the hour of 5:30. An entirely reasonable undertaking for a woman who found that an early evening walk, however brisk the air, was beneficial to her joints. She did not linger. She was not the sort of person who lingered, but she walked at a pace that permitted observation, and what she observed was this. The lamps at Longridge House were already lit when she passed, though the last of the day's pale light had not yet fully departed from the sky. The sitting-room windows glowed with a warm, composed steadiness, and the curtains, she noticed, had not yet been drawn. This was an interesting inversion of the usual order. Most people of Mrs. Finch's generation drew their curtains as the lamps went up, or very shortly thereafter. To light the lamps while the windows remained open to the evening suggested that the lighting had been premature, or, more precisely, that it had been attended to with a care that preceded necessity. The guests had not yet arrived. The lane was quiet. Miss Marple walked on and returned home by way of the church path, thinking about the ordering of small domestic acts and what they sometimes revealed about the state of mind of the person who performed them. She heard the details of the evening itself on the following morning, and from two independent sources, Whodunit, which she had not engineered but accepted as the natural consequence of living in a village where the previous evening's events were rarely kept private beyond breakfast time. The first account came from Miss Holt, who stopped at Miss Marple's gate on her way to the school and offered, with the directness characteristic of her, a brief description of the occasion. It had been, she said, a pleasant enough evening. The supper had been simple and well prepared. The conversation had been agreeable, if not especially lively. Everyone had been quite themselves, which was perhaps the most that one could say of any gathering of that kind. Miss Marple asked, with gentle interest, whether the party had broken up at a reasonable hour. "Quite reasonable," said Miss Holt. "10:30, I should think. Perhaps a little before." She paused. "Mr. Pell left a little earlier than the rest of us. He mentioned needing some air. It wasn't thought anything of at the time." Miss Marple said that one often felt the need of a little air after an indoor evening, particularly at this time of year. Miss Holt agreed, and continued on to school. The second account came from Mrs. Gerald Compton, who appeared at Miss Marple's door mid-morning with the air of a woman who had found herself in possession of something she was not entirely certain how to carry. Marian Compton was a handsome woman in a capable, direct sort of way, and she was not generally given to the kind of visits that existed primarily as vehicles for conversation. Her presence, therefore, carried a small weight of its own. She came in, accepted a chair and the offer of coffee, which she held without drinking, and said, after a moment's settling, that she supposed Miss Marple had heard about poor Mr. Pell. Miss Marple said she had heard nothing particular, which was, at that moment, quite true. Mrs. Compton told her Mr. Pell had been found that morning beyond the garden boundary of Longridge House, at the edge of the orchard path. The gardener had come across him shortly after 7. He was quite dead. The doctor had been called, and then the police, and Mrs. Finch was, as one might imagine, in a considerable state of distress. Miss Marple received this with the composed stillness she brought to all such news, neither theatrical in her concern nor uncomfortably unaffected. She said that it was very dreadful, and that she was sorry for Mrs. Finch, and that she hoped the doctor had been quickly available. Mrs. Compton said that Dr. Henley had come within the half hour, and that Inspector Slack from the County Constabulary had followed not long after. The matter was, it appeared, being treated seriously, though no one had said very much as yet about what was expected to follow. Miss Marple nodded and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, quite quietly, "Was the evening itself as pleasant as Miss Holt described it?" Mrs. Compton looked at her rather carefully. She said it was pleasant. She did. She said it was quite agreeable, if not especially lively. There was a brief pause. Mrs. Compton set down her cup and smoothed her skirt with one deliberate hand. "Yes," she said at last. "Yes, I suppose it was that. Everyone was very civil." It was the word civil that settled in Miss Marple's mind like a stone dropped into still water. "Oh, not warm," not cheerful, not particularly enjoyable, civil. The word of a woman who had been present at something that required, above all things, good manners. After Mrs. Compton had gone, Miss Marple sat for a little while beside the window with her knitting in her lap and the knitting needles at rest. She thought about lamps lit before the curtains were drawn. She thought about a man who had gone outside for a little air and had not returned. She thought about the quality of the word civil, and what a person meant by it when they were describing an evening from which one of the guests had not come home. She thought, too, about the ordering of a guest list written in a steady hand, and the difference between a gathering that had happened upon something unfortunate and a gathering that had, in some sense, been arranged around it. Or as she did not come to any conclusions, it was far too early for conclusions. But she began, with the quiet and methodical attention that was entirely her own, to consider the shape of the evening as it had been described to her. The early lamps, the restrained atmosphere, the civil conversation, the man who had stepped outside, and to wonder what the shape of an evening revealed about the intentions with which it had been designed. Outside, the autumn morning continued in its mild, unhurried way. A thrush moved along the path between the rose beds. The lane beyond the gate was empty and still. Miss Marple picked up her knitting and began the next row with careful, even stitches, and thought that she would very much like to see inside the cloakroom at Longridge House before too long a time had passed. Chapter 3. The cloakroom. Peg bearing one extra coat. The opportunity to visit Longridge House presented itself the following afternoon, and it came about in the most natural way possible, which Miss Marple had found was usually the best way for such things to arrange themselves. Mrs. Finch sent a note round by her daily woman, a capable person named Mrs. Rudge, asking if Miss Marple might be free to call, as she would very much value a little company, and had found the morning rather trying. Miss Marple read this with the attention it deserved, and replied at once that she would come at 3 o'clock and would be very glad to do so. She arrived to find Longridge House wearing a slightly altered aspect from her previous visit. The day was overcast, the sky a flat, undifferentiated grey, and the house, though perfectly in order, had acquired the faintly held quality of a place in which something has recently happened that has not yet been absorbed. The garden path was tidy, the door-knocker was polished, and yet there was a sense, not quite definable, of the house having drawn itself slightly inward. Mrs. Rudge answered the door and led Miss Marple through the hall, with the compressed efficiency of a woman who has been kept busier than usual and is navigating the day on a shortened fuse of patience. Miss Marple noticed as she passed through the hall that the lamp on the hall table was unlit. It was an oil lamp of modest proportions, set on a turned wooden base, and it stood with its glass chimney slightly displaced, as though it had been recently handled and set back not quite precisely. She noted this without pausing, and followed Mrs. Rudge into the sitting-room, where Mrs. Finch was seated in the chair nearest the fire with a rug across her knees, and a posture that suggested determined composure. She rose when Miss Marple entered, which was an indication of genuine feeling, as she would not ordinarily have troubled to do so. They exchanged the brief, warm words that the occasion required, and Miss Marple settled into the chair that was offered, and accepted tea and undertook for the better part of 20 minutes the work of simply being present in a quiet and undemanding way. This was a form of assistance that many people undervalued, and that Miss Marple had long understood to be among the most useful she could offer. Mrs. Finch spoke in time about the morning, the doctor, the police. Inspector Slack had been, sir, in her description, businesslike and thorough and not unkind, though he had asked questions of the kind that made one aware of being asked questions, if one understood the distinction. She had answered everything as clearly as she was able. All the guests, she said, had been spoken to separately, which was quite correct and proper, and had been, none the less, something of an ordeal. "It is always a little strange," Miss Marple said gently, "to be asked to account for an ordinary evening as though it had already been decided that it was not ordinary." Mrs. Finch looked at her with a quick, grateful recognition. "That is precisely it," she said. "That is exactly how it felt." They were quiet for a moment. The fire settled with a small sound of ash. "May I ask," said Miss Marple, in the manner of someone raising a very small and peripheral matter, "whether Inspector Slack has finished with the house? I only ask because I had wondered. That is to say, it occurred to me that you must be finding it rather a business, having things looked at and attended to." "He's finished for the present," said Mrs. Finch. "He may return tomorrow," he said. "But for today the house is quite—" She paused, searching briefly for the word. "Quite our own again." "I am glad," said Miss Marple. "And the cloakroom. I only mention it because Mrs. Rudge's coat was in the hall when I came in, and I thought perhaps there was some question of things having been moved about." It was a small, oblique remark, offered gently, and Miss Marple was quite aware that it rested on a slender pretext. But Mrs. Finch did not appear to find it unusual. There was, she said, something a little odd about the cloakroom as it happened. Inspector Slack had noticed it too, though he had not made a great deal of it. There was a coat on one of the pegs, the third peg, the one nearest the outer wall, which did not belong to any of the remaining guests, and which she herself could not with confidence attribute to anyone. Miss Marple expressed mild interest, and said that coats did have a way of becoming confused in shared spaces. Mrs. Finch agreed, but added, with the careful honesty of a woman who had been thinking about a thing and found she could not unthink it, that this was not quite an ordinary confusion. It was not a coat that had been left behind by accident in the way that scarves and gloves sometimes are. It was a man's coat, she said, a dark wool overcoat of moderate quality, and it had been placed on the peg, not dropped or tucked, but placed, folded once at the collar, and set squarely on the hook in the manner of someone who had put it there with full intention. "I see," said Miss Marple. "And Mr. Pell's coat? I assume his own coat was accounted for." There was a brief pause. "He was found in his coat," Mrs. Finch said. "He had gone outside in it." "Of course," said Miss Marple. "Of course he had." She did not pursue the subject further at that moment, but allowed Mrs. Finch to move the conversation to other ground, which she did with evident relief, speaking for a while about the arrangements she would need to make in the coming days, the question of whether there was anyone among Mr. Pell's connections who ought to be informed, and the general difficulty of knowing how to proceed when one was at the centre of an event one did not fully understand. Miss Marple listened with genuine attention, and offered such practical counsel as she could, and when, shortly before 4 o'clock, the conversation had reached a natural resting point, she said, quite simply, "I wonder if I might use your cloakroom before I put my coat on for the walk home." Mrs. Finch said of course, and directed her through the hall. The cloakroom at Longridge House was a small, neat room off the main corridor, fitted with 4 coat pegs along one wall, a shelf above them, a narrow bench below, and a single window overlooking the side path that ran between the house and the kitchen garden wall. The window was of the sash variety, and it was closed. Miss Marple noted this and turned her attention to the pegs. 3 of them held coats that were readily identifiable as household articles, a gardening jacket of old waxed cotton, a heavier outdoor coat in dark green that was unmistakably Mrs. Finch's, and a lighter mackintosh near the door. On the 3rd peg, as Mrs. Finch had described, hung a man's dark wool overcoat, folded once at the collar, and set neatly on the hook. Miss Marple looked at it for a moment with the careful, unhurried attention of someone examining a thing they expect to be informative. It was a coat of some quality, though not new. The wool had the slight softening of age, and the lining, visible where the collar turned back, was of a deep burgundy silk that had faded somewhat, particularly along the upper edge. The buttons were dark horn, and 3 remaining of what had been 4, the uppermost one having been replaced at some point with a button that was similar but not quite identical, slightly smaller and rounder in profile. The right-hand pocket had been turned out at some point and replaced imperfectly, leaving a small ridge of fabric visible along the lower seam. Miss Marple did not touch the coat. She stood at a distance of perhaps 2 feet, and looked at it in the manner of someone reading a letter that has been left unfolded on a table, attentively, but without making a production of it. The coat had been worn regularly. It had been maintained with care up to a point. The brushing was thorough, the collar reasonably clean, but it showed in its replaced button and its turned pocket the small economies of a person managing on a moderate income with a certain residual pride in appearance. It was a coat that belonged, Miss Marple thought, to a man who had once been accustomed to better and had made his peace with the distance between then and now. She thought of Mr. Arthur Pell, who had come to St. Mary Mead from Harrogate or thereabouts, who kept to himself, who had found the quiet of the village suited him. She thought of the coat he had been wearing when he was found, his own coat in which he had gone outside for a little air, and she thought about this second coat placed with quiet intention on the third peg by someone who had left it there and not returned for it. 2 coats, 1 man. Or perhaps more accurately, 1 coat that had been left behind by someone who had not departed in the usual fashion. Miss Marple washed her hands at the small basin in the corner of the room and dried them on the clean linen square provided, and looked once more at the coat on the third peg before she opened the door and returned to the hall. Mrs. Rudge was crossing the hall with a tray as Miss Marple emerged, and they exchanged the small pleasantries that such crossings require. Miss Marple mentioned, in the easy tone of afterthought, that it was a pity the cloakroom window faced north, as it must make the room rather cold in winter. Mrs. Rudge agreed, with the authority of someone who cleaned the room regularly, that it was always the coldest spot in the house, and that she had frequently said as much to Mrs. Finch. She added that it had been properly shut up on the evening of the supper, and as she had checked the windows herself before the guests arrived, that being part of her usual preparation. Miss Marple said that Mrs. Rudge was very thorough, which was no more than the truth, and made her way back to the sitting-room. She said goodbye to Mrs. Finch with genuine warmth, promised to come again in a day or 2, and walked home along Maple Lane in the grey October afternoon, with her coat buttoned to the throat and her mind engaged in the quiet methodical work of placing each small thing she had learned beside each other, small thing and seeing how they lay. A coat placed with intention, a window properly shut before the guests arrived, a hall lamp unlit and with its chimney slightly displaced, as though it had been attended to and then abandoned mid-task. Each detail was, in itself, no more than a detail. Miss Marple was perfectly well aware of that. She was not the kind of woman who constructed cathedrals from single bricks, but she was the kind of woman who noticed when bricks had been placed rather than fallen, and who understood that placing was, in its quiet way, a form of statement. Someone had left a coat at Longridge House. They had left it on the third peg, folded with care, and they had not returned for it. That was a fact. What it meant she could not yet say with confidence, but she thought that she would like, before very much longer, to know a little more about the history of Mr. Arthur Pell. Not the version that St. Mary Mead held, which was thin and civil and perfectly sufficient for village purposes. The other version, the one that explained why a man who kept to himself had nonetheless been considered essential to a carefully assembled guest list. The lane was quiet around her, and the first lamps of the afternoon were beginning to appear in the cottage windows as she walked. Miss Marple noticed them, as she noticed everything, and thought that there was something rather pointed about a lamp, the way it could be a signal, or a marker, or simply a habit. It depended entirely on the person who lit it, and what, if anything, they had wished to communicate by the act. She turned in at her own gate and went inside and put the kettle on and sat down to think. Chapter 4. Footprints pressed along the orchard path. Inspector Slack came to Miss Marple on the Friday morning, which surprised her less than it might have surprised some people. He was a man of middle years and moderate build, with a manner that conveyed industriousness without quite conveying ease, and he had learned through a number of previous encounters with Miss Marple that had not always concluded as he had initially anticipated, to treat her presence in the vicinity of a difficulty with a respect that was, if not warm, at least honest. He sat in the chair she offered him, and accepted tea with the air of a man doing so for practical reasons rather than social ones, and he placed his notebook on the arm of the chair with the careful habit of someone who had been writing in notebooks for a great many years. He told her, with a directness she appreciated, what was known so far. Mr. Arthur Pell had died as the result of a single blow to the back of the head, delivered, the doctor believed, by an object of moderate weight with a smooth, curved surface. No such object had been recovered from the orchard path or its immediate surroundings. Mr. Pell had last been seen by the assembled guests at approximately 10 o'clock on the Tuesday evening, when he had mentioned to those nearest him that he intended to step outside briefly for some air. The night had been cool, but not severe. The orchard path, which ran along the eastern boundary of the Longridge House garden, was accessible from the garden by a wooden gate set in the boundary wall, and from the lane beyond by a second gate at the far end. Neither gate had been found locked. Miss Marple listened to all of this with her hands folded in her lap and her expression one of attentive concern. When Inspector Slack had finished, she said that it was a very distressing business, and asked whether he had found the path informative. Inspector Slack said that it had been examined thoroughly. There were footprints, he said, though not of a kind that provided clear direction. The path was a mixture of compacted earth and grass, and the impressions were faint and in places overlapping. The doctor estimated that Mr. Pell had been where he was found for some hours before discovery, which meant the ground had had time to settle, and the morning dew had softened such definition as the prints might once have held. Overlapping, Miss Marple repeated with gentle interest. More than one set, Inspector Slack confirmed. Which is to be expected, I suppose, given that several people may have used the path during the evening, or prior to the evening for that matter. It's a garden path. People walk on it. They do, said Miss Marple, though perhaps not usually at that hour, in October, in the dark. Inspector Slack looked at her with the expression of a man who has just been offered a remark he would have preferred to have made himself. He said that this was a fair point, and that the overlapping of the prints was, in his view, the most interesting feature of the path. He had, he said, identified at least 2 distinct sets of impressions in the section nearest the orchard boundary wall, and possibly a third, though the third was less certain. Miss Marple said that was very interesting indeed. They discussed the guests briefly. Inspector Slack had spoken to each of them and found their accounts consistent, though he used the word consistent in the manner of a man who was not entirely certain whether consistency was reassuring or the reverse. They all recalled Mr. Pell's departure from the sitting room at around 10 o'clock. They all agreed that no one had gone out after him. They all reported that the remainder of the evening had proceeded in an unremarkable fashion, until Mrs. Finch had suggested, at 10:15, that the hour was growing late. The guests had collected their coats and departed within a reasonable interval of one another. No one went to look for him, Miss Marple observed. No one did, said Inspector Slack. They assumed he'd gone home independently. The garden gate to the lane was a perfectly accessible route. It was thought he had simply departed without going back through the house, and no one thought it unusual that he had not said goodbye. There was a brief pause. Mrs. Compton, Inspector Slack said with a slight flatness of tone, said that Mr. Pell was not a man who placed great emphasis on social formality. Miss Marple received this with a small nod. That is one explanation, she said. After Inspector Slack had gone, she sat for a while with the remains of the tea tray, and applied her mind to the question of footprints in the manner she found most productive, which was not to think about footprints directly, but to think about the people who made them, and what they might have been doing with their feet at any given moment. 2 sets, clearly, possibly 3. Mr. Pell had walked along the orchard path. Someone else had walked along it also, and possibly a third person, though the evidence was, by the inspector's own account, less certain on that point. One did not ordinarily walk along a garden path in the dark in late October for the pleasure of the exercise. One walked because one was going somewhere, or because one was following someone, or because one had arranged to meet someone, or because one had seen someone go and wished, for reasons of one's own, to know where they had gone. Miss Marple thought about the wooden gate at the far end of the path, unlocked, accessible from the lane. It was perfectly possible to enter the garden that way from outside the property, if one knew the gate was there and knew it would be unlocked. It was equally possible to exit by it. Mr. Pell might have gone out into the lane. Someone from within the garden might have followed him, or someone from outside might have come in. None of this resolved anything, but it arranged the possibilities in a way that was more useful than leaving them scattered. She put on her outdoor things after luncheon and walked, at a considered pace, to the far end of Maple Lane, where a narrow track ran along the back boundary of several of the larger properties. She had walked this way before, on many occasions, and there was nothing unusual in her doing so. The track was muddy in places and overhung on one side by the boundary hedgerows of the properties backing onto it, and on the other by a straggling line of elder and hawthorn. The gate into the Longridge House orchard was set flush with the hedge, of weathered grey wood, and it stood, as Inspector Slack had described, quite unlocked. Miss Marple did not open it. She stood beside it and looked at the ground in the immediate vicinity. The track here was soft, and she could see a number of impressions in the mud, boot prints mostly, and the broader rounded marks of shoes, in various states of overlap and definition. She was not a forensic examiner, and she did not propose to act as one, but she noticed that directly in front of the gate, in the narrow strip of earth between the track and the base of the gate itself, there was a clear impression of a shoe. A single impression, left foot, pointed inward toward the gate, as though someone had stood facing it for a moment before, doing what exactly she could not say, standing and deciding. That was the impression it gave her. Standing and deciding. She walked home by way of the lane that ran past the old mill and Mr. Pell's house, which was a modest brick-and-flint cottage with a short front garden and curtains that someone, the police she assumed, had thought to draw. She paused at the gate for a moment, not in any investigative spirit, but in the simple human acknowledgement that a man had lived there and no longer did, and that this was a fact worth pausing over. She'd been thinking about Mr. Pell's history since Wednesday, and she had made, by quiet means, some small amount of progress. The vicar, with whom she had spoken on Thursday after the morning service, had confirmed that Mr. Pell had attended church regularly, and was, in his estimation, a man of good character and settled habits. He had come to St. Mary Mead, the vicar understood, and after some period of professional difficulty, something connected with a business arrangement that had not concluded as hoped. The vicar had not pressed for details, as it was not his practice to do so. But he had formed the impression that Mr. Pell had come to the village with the intention of placing some distance between himself and his previous circumstances. Miss Marple had also spoken, by telephone, to her niece's husband's cousin, who was a solicitor in the neighbouring town and who had, as it happened, been acquainted in a professional capacity with someone who had known Mr. Pell in his Harrogate years. This connection was slender and required 2 intermediary explanations before it became useful, but it yielded the information that Mr. Arthur Pell had, some years before his arrival in St. Mary Mead, had been involved in a property venture of some ambition that had not succeeded, and that the failure of this venture had left certain other parties in a position of some financial inconvenience. The details were vague, as second-hand professional gossip tends to be, but the outline was sufficiently clear to be interesting. A property venture, other parties, financial inconvenience. Miss Marple stood at Mr. Pell's gate and looked at his curtained windows and thought about the guest list written in a steady hand. She thought about Mr. Gerald Compton, who was a retired solicitor with a careful manner. She thought about Mr. Douglas Weatherby, whose business affairs had passed through a period of difficulty before he came to St. Mary Mead. She thought about Mrs. Eleanor Finch, who had lived at Longridge House for 20 years and was, by all accounts, a woman of comfortable but not unlimited means. She thought about the fact that each of these people had been selected specifically and deliberately for an evening at Longridge House, and she thought about what might connect them beyond the ordinary threads of village acquaintance. She could not yet say with certainty. But she was beginning to feel the shape of it, in the way that one sometimes feels the shape of a room in the dark. Not clearly, not completely, but sufficiently to move without stumbling. The afternoon was drawing in, the sky pressing lower and the lane growing damp underfoot. Miss Marple turned from Mr. Pell's gate and walked home, her pace steady and her mind occupied with the particular patience she brought to things that were not yet ready to be understood. Footprints in soft ground. She reflected, told you where someone had been. What they told you rather less reliably was why. And in her experience, it was always the why that mattered most. The where was merely the where. It was the why that contained the person. And she had a feeling, quiet but persistent, that when she understood the why of Mr. Arthur Pell's walk along the orchard path on a cold October evening, she would understand a great deal else besides. Chapter 5. A window left slightly raised at the back. Saturday brought a thin, determined rain that discouraged outdoor activity and encouraged the kind of indoor reflection that Miss Marple found, on the whole, rather productive. She spent the morning at her writing desk attending to correspondence that had accumulated over the week, and the afternoon in her sitting room with her knitting and a sustained period of thought that she did not allow to be interrupted by anything less pressing than the kettle. By Sunday the rain had lifted, and the village had resumed its customary weekend composure. Miss Marple attended the morning service at the church, exchanged a few words at the gate with the vicar and with one or two others, and walked home by the longer route, which took her past the post office and the row of cottages on the north side of the green. It was on this route that she encountered Miss Clara Holt, who was coming from the direction of the school with a canvas bag of what appeared to be exercise books and an expression of moderate preoccupation. Miss Holt was a woman who carried her thoughts visibly, not through any lack of self-command, but through a straightforwardness of character that found concealment mildly distasteful. When she saw Miss Marple, she paused with the directness of someone who has been thinking about a conversation and finds themselves unexpectedly presented with the opportunity to have it. "I hoped I might see you," she said, which was the kind of remark Miss Marple found rather more informative than a chance greeting. They walked together as far as the bench beside the churchyard wall, which was sheltered enough from the remaining dampness to be usable, and sat down with the mutual ease of two women who have no particular vanity about sitting on outdoor benches in October. Miss Holt set her bag of exercise books on the ground, and rested her hands on her knees in the manner of a person preparing to say something they have been composing for some time. "I have been thinking," she said, "about something I noticed on Tuesday evening, which I did not mention to Inspector Slack." Miss Marple said quite gently that it was sometimes difficult to know what was worth mentioning. "It may be nothing," Miss Holt said. "It probably is nothing. But it has sat with me rather persistently, which I have found, in general, has to be a reason to speak." Miss Marple agreed that persistence was usually significant. Miss Holt had been at Longridge House since 7:30 on the evening of the gathering. She had arrived a few minutes after the Comptons, who had come together, and some time before Mr. Weatherby, who had arrived last among the guests at perhaps 7:45. The early part of the evening had been spent in the sitting-room, where Mrs. Finch had provided sherry and the kind of light, circling conversation that precedes supper. At some point before supper was laid, Miss Holt estimated 8:30, though she was not certain to the minute. She had gone in search of the cloakroom, having not visited Longridge House recently enough to remember its location with confidence. She had gone, as she thought, in the right direction, but had turned into the back corridor rather than the hall and found herself briefly at the rear of the house. It was there that she had noticed the window. It was a sash window set into the back wall of the corridor, at the point where the corridor turned toward the kitchen passage. The window faced the rear garden, which ran parallel to the orchard path on the inner side of the boundary wall. It was open, not widely, but by perhaps 4 inches at the lower sash. She had noticed it because the air that came through it was noticeably cold, and carried the faint smell of damp leaves, which was distinctive against the warmth of the house. She had not given it a great deal of thought at the time. Houses have windows that are left open for ventilation. It was only afterwards, she said, or when she had heard what had happened and had found herself going over the evening in her mind with rather more attention, that the window had returned to her as something worth examining. "It was a cold evening," she said. "Mrs. Finch is a careful woman. I cannot imagine she would have left a rear window open in October without purpose. And when I think of where that window looks, directly onto the garden, at the point where the path runs along the inner wall—" She left the sentence where it was. Miss Marple looked at the middle distance with the thoughtful composure of someone turning a fact carefully in their hands. "Did you happen to notice," she said, whether the window was open when you came in. That is, at 7:30, or whether it might have been opened later in the evening." "I cannot say with certainty," Miss Holt replied. "I noticed it only the once. I did not go back to that corridor." "No," said Miss Marple. "There would have been no reason to." They sat for a moment in the quiet of the churchyard lane. A blackbird moved along the top of the wall with proprietary self-assurance. Somewhere in the near distance a gate was latched. "You said you did not mention it to Inspector Slack," Miss Marple said. "I did not," Miss Holt replied, with a slight tightening of someone who is aware that this requires explanation. "I was going to, but when he asked me about the evening, there was something about the way the questions were framed. What I had seen, what I had heard, even what the others had said, that made me feel I was being asked to account for myself as much as to assist him. I'm not comfortable with that sort of questioning. I answered him truthfully and fully, but I answered what I was asked. The window had not been raised as a specific subject, and She paused briefly. "I did not raise it." "I think," said Miss Marple in a tone of perfect equanimity, "that you should tell him. Not because I think you did wrong to hold it, but because these things are more useful when they are in the right hands. And it is better, on the whole, to offer information early than to offer it later when it may seem as though it has been assessed before it was shared." Miss Holt received this without any particular show of relief, but with the expression of a person who has been told something they already knew and was glad to have confirmed. She said she would telephone the inspector that afternoon. They parted shortly after, and Miss Marple walked the remainder of the way home in the cool, cleared air of the post-rain morning, thinking about the rear corridor of Longridge House and the window set into its back wall. A window open by 4 inches, overlooking the garden and the path along the boundary wall. Open before supper, if Miss Holt had noticed it at 8:30. The supper had concluded, she understood, at around 9:30. Mr. Pell had gone outside at 10 o'clock. There was an interval, then, of approximately an hour and a half during which the window had been open, possibly longer if it had been opened earlier in the evening. Long enough for anyone positioned at that window to observe the garden. Long enough also for the sound of movement on the path to carry inward to anyone listening in that corridor. Miss Marple did not subscribe to the dramatic interpretation in which a single open window accounted for all the mischief of an evening. Life was considerably less tidy than fiction, but she did think that a window left open on a cold October night, in a house whose mistress was notably careful, was a thing that deserved to be understood on its own terms before being dismissed. And she also thought, and this was a thought she turned over with particular care, about who at that gathering might have had reason to open such a window. Not the guests, who were in the sitting room for the greater part of the evening. The kitchen staff, if Mrs. Finch had engaged any for the occasion, were a possibility, though a window in a back corridor was not a kitchen window. Mrs. Finch herself might have opened it, for some reason she had not yet mentioned. Or someone. And this was the thought that Miss Marple set carefully to one side while she continued to walk. Someone might have opened it not for ventilation at all, but for information. She found Mr. Douglas Weatherby in her thoughts with some regularity that afternoon. He was a man she had observed on several occasions in the village, and each time she had found herself returning to the quality she had first identified in him, a certain comfort with the surface of things, a smoothness that was not precisely dishonesty, but existed in the same general neighbourhood. He was a man who presented well and offered little, which was not always a character flaw, but was sometimes useful to the kind of person who preferred that others not look too closely. She knew very little about his period of business difficulty, beyond the fact that it had occurred, and that he had come to St. Mary Mead in its aftermath. She knew that he was pleasant company, and that he had established himself in the village without notable friction. She knew that his connection to the other guests at Tuesday's gathering was one she had not yet been able to trace clearly. She intended to remedy that, in the patient sideways fashion that was most likely to be productive. On Sunday evening she wrote a brief note to her niece in Lyme Regis, whose husband had worked for some years in commercial property before his retirement, and who might, without making a particular business of it, be able to recall something useful about a venture in the north of England that had not concluded happily, and had left a number of people in a condition of financial inconvenience. She sealed the envelope and set it on the hall table for the morning post, and went to bed at her usual hour and lay in the familiar dark of her own room listening to the last sounds of the village evening, a motor car passing in the distance, an owl in the elm trees at the field edge, and thought about a window open 4 inches in a cold corridor, and what it meant to leave a thing open that ordinary prudence would keep closed. In her experience, things that were left open when they ought to have been shut were almost never the result of mere oversight. People who were careful in the arrangement of their houses were careful for a reason, and departures from that care were departures of equal deliberateness, even when they appeared accidental. Mrs. Finch was a careful woman. Miss Holt had said so without knowing she was saying it, and Miss Marple had thought it from the beginning. Careful women did not leave rear windows open on cold October evenings without purpose. The question, as Miss Marple settled towards sleep, was whose purpose it had served. Chapter 6. The bread knife set apart from the supper table. The reply from Miss Marple's niece arrived on Tuesday morning, which was rather quicker than she had anticipated, and suggested that her niece had found the matter sufficiently interesting to attend to promptly. The letter was written in the brisk, affectionate hand of a woman who enjoyed being useful, and had the good sense not to make a production of it. It ran to 2 pages, and Miss Marple read it through twice at the breakfast table before setting it beside her cup with the satisfied expression of someone who has opened a drawer expecting to find a button, and has found, instead, the complete set. Her niece's husband, it emerged, did know something of the property venture Miss Marple had inquired about, though he had come at it from the periphery rather than the centre. It had been, as the solicitor's account had suggested, a scheme of some ambition. The development of a block of residential properties in the outskirts of a northern town, organised by a consortium of investors who had each committed a significant sum in the expectation of returns that had not materialised. The venture had collapsed, not through any single dramatic event, but through the gradual and dispiriting accumulation of planning difficulties, contractor failures, and— her niece's husband had been somewhat circumspect on this point, though clear enough— certain irregularities in the management of the invested funds that had never been formally investigated, but had left a residue of quiet grievance among those who had lost money. Mr. Arthur Pell, her niece's husband believed, had been the organising figure. Not the sole architect, perhaps, but the face of it, the man whose name had appeared on the prospectus, whose recommendations had drawn people in, and whose management of the enterprise had proved in the end a source of considerable disappointment. He had not, as far as could be established, acted with deliberate dishonesty in the legal sense. But there was a difference between legal exoneration and moral satisfaction, and the people who had lost money were, by all accounts, not satisfied. Miss Marple folded the letter and placed it in the drawer of her writing desk, where she kept things she wished to return to, and sat for a moment with her second cup of tea, and the quiet, assembling feeling of a picture that was acquiring definition. She thought about Mr. Gerald Compton, who was a retired solicitor. A solicitor, particularly one with a practice of some years in a neighbouring district, was precisely the sort of person who might have had professional dealings with a property venture of that kind. He might have advised a client who had invested. He might have been engaged to review the prospectus. He might indeed have invested himself, though that she could not know. What she did know was that his manner, as described by those who had been at the gathering, was one of polite scepticism. A man who had once trusted a prospectus presented by Mr. Arthur Pell, and had subsequently found reason to regret it, might well have developed a permanent inclination towards scepticism, and Mr. Douglas Weatherby, whose own business difficulties had preceded his arrival in St. Mary Mead, might those difficulties have had their origin in the same venture. Yet a man who had invested and lost would have had his comfortable life reduced, his plans revised, his future narrowed in ways that left their mark. He had come to the village 3 years ago, presenting well, offering little. That was a recognisable portrait of a man who had learned, through painful experience, the value of discretion. Mrs. Eleanor Finch, then. What was her connection to Mr. Pell and his failed enterprise? Miss Marple did not yet know, but she intended to find out. And Miss Clara Holt, precise, forthright, practical Miss Holt, had she too been touched by it, or was her presence at the gathering of a different kind altogether? These thoughts occupied Miss Marple through the morning, and they were still occupying her, in a more settled fashion, when she received a visit that afternoon from a source she had not anticipated. A Mr. Gerald Compton arrived at her door at 2:30. He was dressed, as was his habit, with care, a dark jacket, a tie of sober stripe, shoes that had been properly attended to that morning. His expression was composed in the manner of a man who has decided to do something and is proceeding with it methodically. He accepted the chair she offered and declined tea, which told her that he had not come for the comfort of it. He was not, he said, entirely sure why he had come. He had found himself over the past several days in the somewhat unusual position of knowing more than he had said, and being uncertain what ought to be done with the knowledge. He had spoken to Inspector Slack naturally, and had answered the inspector's questions fully and honestly. But Inspector Slack's questions, he said, with the dry precision of someone who had spent a professional lifetime distinguishing between the question asked and the question that needed asking, had not been the right questions. Miss Marple said that Inspector Slack was a thorough man, and that thoroughness and direction were sometimes different virtues. Mr. Compton gave the faint, dry indication of a smile and said that this was precisely so. He had known Arthur Pell, he said, before St. Mary Mead. He had encountered him in a professional capacity some 9 years ago in connection with a property matter. He did not name the venture, but his description of it accorded with everything Miss Marple had assembled from other sources. He had acted for a client. He would not say who, as that was not information he was at liberty to share, who had suffered losses. The matter had not proceeded to any formal action, for reasons that were, in his assessment, partly pragmatic and partly the result of a certain reluctance, on the part of those affected to draw public attention to the fact that they had been persuaded by a prospectus that, in retrospect, had not borne scrutiny. He had not known, when he came to St. Mary Mead, that Arthur Pell was already living there. He had discovered this within the first month of his arrival, and had found it, he said, with the measured understatement of a person who chose their words with professional care, somewhat disagreeable. Miss Marple said she could entirely understand that. Had Mrs. Finch known of the connection, she asked, when she drew up her guest list. There was a pause of sufficient length to be informative. I believe, Mr. Compton said, that Eleanor Finch knew a good deal more about the connections among her guests than she has indicated to anyone. I am not in a position to say what, but I am in a position to say that her invitation, when it arrived, struck me as unusual, and that when I mentioned this to Marion, she said— he paused again briefly— she said that she thought we should go. Miss Marple allowed this to rest in the room for a moment. And Mr. Weatherby, she said, is he also connected to the property matter? Mr. Compton looked at her with the expression of a man who has just been reminded that he has underestimated his interlocutor. I believe so, he said, though not in the same capacity as others. Weatherby is not, he considered his words, he is not a man who's been wronged in the straightforward sense. His position in the whole affair is rather more complicated. He would not say more on that point, and Miss Marple did not press him. There were questions that produced less useful answers the harder they were pushed. He left at 3:15, and Miss Marple saw him out with the warm composure she maintained on all such occasions, and stood for a moment at the door watching him walk back along the lane with the controlled, deliberate step of a man carrying something he has not quite managed to set down. She went back inside and through to the kitchen to put the kettle on, and as she waited for it to boil, she thought about supper tables and the things that were found on them, or not found on them, or found at a remove from their proper place. She had not forgotten the bread knife. She had been thinking about it steadily since Inspector Slack's mention of it, or rather, since Mrs. Finch had mentioned it, in a single passing remark during one of Miss Marple's visits, as one of the details the police had noted. A bread knife resting on the sideboard, apart from the supper setting placed neatly aside, not dropped, not left carelessly, placed. In the ordinary run of a supper party, a bread knife occupied a specific position in the domestic arrangement. It was laid with the other implements, used in the course of the meal, and returned or left in place at the conclusion of it. To find it set apart was not, in itself, alarming. Kitchen things were moved for any number of practical reasons, but placed neatly suggested intention, and placed apart from its setting suggested either that it had been used for a purpose other than the one the setting required, or that someone had moved it after the meal for a reason they had not explained. The bread knife had a blade. It was a smooth, curved implement of moderate weight. Miss Marple was aware that she was not a pathologist, and that drawing conclusions of a specific character from the description of a blow was not within her competence. But she was aware of the description Inspector Slack had given: a smooth, curved surface, moderate weight, and she allowed this to sit beside her knowledge of the knife without insisting on a conclusion that the facts had not yet earned. She would not say anything about this to Inspector Slack. Not yet. He had noted the knife. He was not unintelligent. And if the thought had occurred to Miss Marple, it would occur to him in time. The difficulty was whether he would connect the knife to the coat to the window, to the footprints to the guest list in the way that all of them, taken together, demanded to be connected. She thought it likely that he would manage some of it. She thought it equally likely that the part which required understanding of a particular kind of human arrangement, the kind that operated through shared history and unspoken agreement and the careful management of an evening, was the part that would give him most difficulty. Miss Marple poured her tea and carried it back to the sitting room and sat with it in the fading afternoon light, thinking about an evening that had been arranged too carefully to leave room for chance, and about a bread knife set neatly apart from its proper place, and about the difference between a thing that happened and a thing that had been prepared for. She thought, too, about what Mr. Compton had said of his wife, that Marian had felt they should go. Not that she'd wished to, or looked forward to it, or seen no reason not to, that they should. It was the word of obligation, not inclination, and it had been used by a composed and practical woman who did not, Miss Marple was quite certain, use words carelessly. She would need to speak with Marian Compton, not at any great length, but soon. Chapter 7. A garden bench turned toward the house. Miss Marple did not seek out Marian Compton directly. She had learned, through many years of quiet observation, that a conversation approached too deliberately had a way of producing exactly the kind of answers one had already anticipated, which were rarely the most informative kind. The most useful conversations were those that arose of their own accord, in conditions of sufficient ease that the other person did not feel themselves to be under examination. This required patience, and a willingness to wait for the occasion rather than manufacture it. The occasion presented itself on Wednesday afternoon, in circumstances that were entirely natural and carried no suggestion of arrangement. Miss Marple was returning from a visit to the village shop, La Salpe, where she had collected a small amount of wool in a shade of blue she had been waiting some weeks for, when she passed the bench on the green at the precise moment that Marian Compton sat down upon it. Mrs. Compton had the air of a woman who has been walking with a purpose and has temporarily mislaid it, and she looked up at Miss Marple with an expression that contained, beneath its surface composure, a quality of tiredness that was not entirely physical. Miss Marple sat down beside her, settled her bag on her lap, and remarked that the green looked particularly well at this time of year, which it did, in the subdued and honest way of October green. No pretence of summer, but a quiet, resolved beauty that suited it rather better. Mrs. Compton agreed that it did. She was silent for a moment and then said, without particular preamble, that she supposed Miss Marple had spoken with Gerald. Miss Marple said that Mr. Compton had been kind enough to call on her earlier in the week. Mrs. Compton turned this over briefly. "He will have been careful," she said. "He's always careful. It is a professional instinct, I think, that one does not quite lose." She paused. "Did he tell you about the venture?" Miss Marple said that he had mentioned it, in general terms. "Then I can be more particular," said Marian Compton, with the tone of a woman who has been waiting for permission to say something, and is relieved that it has been implicitly granted. She was, Miss Marple had always felt, a more direct person than her husband, and not less intelligent, differently intelligent, with less interest in the architecture of her own presentation, and more in the substance of the matter at hand. She spoke now with the clarity of someone who had been thinking carefully for several days, and had organised her thoughts into an order she found satisfactory. She had known Arthur Pell, she said, from before St Mary Mead, not from the property venture. That had been Gerald's introduction to him, through the professional connection he had declined to name. Her own acquaintance with Pell was older and quieter, and of a different character. They'd grown up in the same district, had known one another's families in the distant, unremarkable way of families who move in adjacent circles without ever becoming intimate. She had not thought of him for years, when Gerald had mentioned, in the early weeks of their life in St Mary Mead, that Arthur Pell was the man who lived in the cottage by the old mill. She had felt, she searched for the word, recognised, as though something she had long ago filed away under completed had, without her knowledge, been refiled elsewhere. "Did Mr. Pell know that you had a prior acquaintance?" Miss Marple asked. "He knew," said Marion Compton. "He had always known who I was. That was characteristic of him. He was the kind of man who knew things about people and said very little about it. It gave him, I think, a certain sense of equilibrium." She said the word with a precision that suggested she had arrived at it after considering and discarding several others. And Miss Marple thought about this and said that it was a quality she had observed in certain kinds of people, not malicious in itself, but potentially uncomfortable for those in its vicinity. "Uncomfortable is a mild word," said Mrs. Compton without particular emphasis. She had known, she said, when Eleanor Finch's invitation arrived, what it was likely to be about, not the details, but the general character of it. Eleanor Finch was a woman she had known slightly for years. They had met through church, through the occasional village function, in the tolerant, civil way of women whose lives overlap at the edges without connecting at the centre. She would not have expected to be invited to a small supper at Longridge House under ordinary circumstances, and when the invitation arrived she had understood at once that the circumstances were not ordinary. She had told Gerald they should go because she had felt that it was better to be present than to be absent. This was a form of reasoning that she recognised upon reflection as somewhat circular, but it was what she had felt. At the supper itself, she said, the evening had proceeded in a manner that was outwardly pleasant, and inwardly rather like the surface of a river over a complicated bed. Everyone had been civil. Everyone had been correct. The conversation had moved across topics in the easy, uninstructive way of conversation, among people who were attending to something other than the words being exchanged. Mr. Pell had been attentive and quiet, as he generally was in company. He'd contributed to the conversation in small, careful ways. He had given no indication that he was aware of any particular tension, or if he was, he had given no indication that it troubled him. At around 10 o'clock he had stood, mentioned that he would take a little air and gone toward the hall. She had not watched him particularly closely at that moment. She had been, as she said, attending to something else. "What had you been attending to?" Miss Marple asked, in the light, interested tone of someone asking about the weather. Marion Compton looked at her hands for a moment. "I had been watching Douglas Weatherby," she said. "He had been not inattentive exactly. He was perfectly well-mannered throughout. But there was a quality to his attention during the evening that I found, I'm not sure why, slightly uncharacteristic. He is usually very even. That evening he was even in a way that required effort. There is a difference." Miss Marple said that there was, and that the difference was usually perceptible to anyone paying the right kind of attention. "He had gone out once before Arthur did," Mrs. Compton said, and then stopped. Miss Marple waited. "I do not mean that he went outside. He left the sitting room for some time, perhaps 10 minutes, perhaps a little more, and then returned. It was not remarked upon. People step out for various reasons, but he was gone for a time, and when he came back there was something about his manner, a steadiness that had not quite been there before, that I noticed." She was not accusing Douglas Weatherby of anything, she said. She wished to be very clear about that. She was simply reporting what she had observed, because she had found it more difficult than she anticipated to carry it around without sharing it, and because Inspector Slack's method of questioning had not, in her opinion, left much room for observations of this particular texture. Miss Marple said she understood entirely, and that she was grateful, and that Mrs. Compton had been very helpful. They sat together for a few more minutes in the quiet of the October afternoon, two women on a bench, to all appearances simply resting, and then went their separate ways. Miss Marple walked home at a pace that was, even by her standards, deliberately unhurried. She wanted the open air around her for a little longer, and the particular quality of thinking that walking permitted. She thought about Douglas Weatherby and his effortful evenness. She thought about the 10 minutes, or perhaps a little more, during which he had been absent from the sitting room. She thought about the rear corridor, and the window Miss Holt had found open, and the sash that gave onto the garden, and the path running along the inner boundary wall. 10 minutes was sufficient time to walk to the back of the house, to open or find open a rear window, to look out, or to exchange a few words with someone on the path below. She also thought about the garden bench. She had not been inside the Longridge house garden since before the gathering, but Mrs. Finch had mentioned it, with a faint perplexity, in the course of one of their recent conversations. The bench that stood at the garden's eastern edge, a wooden bench of some years, set with its back to the house in the ordinary fashion, looking out toward the orchard and the boundary wall, and had been found, on the morning after the gathering, facing inward. Not dramatically shifted, but clearly, deliberately reoriented. Its legs had left marks in the damp grass where it had been turned. It now faced the house rather than the orchard. Inspector Slack had noted it without placing great emphasis upon it. Miss Marple, on hearing of it, had placed considerable emphasis upon it in her own mind, and had been adding to that emphasis steadily ever since. A bench turned to face the house, at the eastern edge of the garden near the boundary wall. If one sat on that bench, or positioned oneself near it, one would have a clear view of the rear of the house, the back corridor window among them, set into the wall above the garden at a height that was, she estimated, perhaps 12 feet from the ground, low enough to be heard from, low enough for sound to pass between. She thought about Mr. Pell, who had come outside for air at 10 o'clock, and she thought about the kind of man who kept his equilibrium by knowing things about people and saying very little. A man like that, she reflected, did not generally go outside alone on a cold October evening without purpose. He had gone outside to meet someone, or to be somewhere he was expected. She was becoming increasingly certain of that. And the bench had been turned not by the person who went outside, but by the person who had been watching the window, or watching the path, or ensuring that whatever was being observed could be observed at the right angle. The question of who had turned it remained open, but it was becoming, yes, in Miss Marple's mind, a question with a narrowing number of possible answers. She let herself in at her own gate, deposited the wool on the hall table, and went to the kitchen with the purposeful air of a woman who has a great deal to think about and finds that a cup of tea assists the process considerably. She was, she thought, nearly at the point where the thinking could begin in earnest. Nearly, but not quite. There was still one thread she had not pulled with sufficient care, and that was the question of what exactly Douglas Weatherby's position in the whole affair had been. Not the simplified version, the wronged investor, the man of reduced circumstances, but the more complicated thing Mr. Compton had hinted at and declined to elaborate. She intended to find out. She thought she knew how to go about it. And she thought that when she did, the bench and the window and the coat and the knife would arrange themselves at last into the single, quiet, inevitable shape she could already feel forming at the edge of her understanding. Chapter 8. The hall lamp burning long after midnight. The question of Douglas Weatherby's position in the affair resolved itself, as such things sometimes did, not through direct inquiry, but through a combination of quiet persistence and the particular generosity of a village that did not always know how much it knew. Miss Marple had been considering since Mr. Compton's visit the most productive approach to a man whose surface she had always found smooth, and whose interior she had consistently found opaque. Direct conversation had its uses, but with a man whose instinct was toward presentation, it tended to produce a very polished and largely uninformative result. She required, instead, someone who had known him in a context other than the village, someone who had encountered Douglas Weatherby at a moment when the presentation had not yet been composed or had briefly come apart. She found this person, with the unforced serendipity that rewarded patience more reliably than urgency, in the person of Miss Lavinia Brent. Miss Brent was not a St. Mary Mead resident. She was a visitor staying for a fortnight with her elderly cousin Mrs. Parks, who lived in the narrow cottage opposite the post office, and whose acquaintance Miss Marple had maintained for some years through the exchange of notes on the cultivation of sweet peas, a subject on which they were both moderately expert. Miss Marple called on Mrs. Parks on Thursday morning, ostensibly to return a borrowed volume on soil management, and found Miss Brent in the sitting-room, occupying the armchair nearest the window with the proprietary ease of a guest who has been in residence long enough to acquire preferences. Miss Brent was a small, lively woman of 60 or so, with quick eyes and the conversational style of someone who had lived in several places and found them all interesting, which Miss Marple regarded as a quality of considerable value. She came, it emerged, from a town in the North Midlands, and had at one time been engaged in the administration of a small investment company, which had given her, she said, an education in human nature that no formal study could have equalled. When the conversation turned, as it did with a naturalness that required very little assistance, to the question of people who move from one part of the country to another in search of a quieter life, Miss Brent offered, with the satisfied air of one producing a relevant example, that she had known a man of exactly that description, a Mr. Weatherby, who had come from their district some years ago after a rather difficult period. Miss Marple expressed mild interest and asked, without particular emphasis, what sort of difficulty it had been. Miss Brent said that it was, in summary, the sort of difficulty that arose when a man who was not quite dishonest placed himself in a position that made honesty rather inconvenient. Mr. Weatherby had been, in her understanding, a secondary figure in the property venture that had caused such trouble, not the organiser, not one of the principal investors, but a man who had acted as a kind of intermediary. He had introduced people to the venture. He had, in the language of the business, brought others in. Some of these people had been his friends, some had been his professional contacts. Several had lost substantial sums. He had not, she was careful to say, done anything that could be called illegal in the strict sense. He had made representations that he may have believed at the time, but there was a difference, she said, with the precision of someone who had spent a career in the vicinity of such distinctions, between believing something and taking sufficient care to know whether it was worth believing. And Douglas Weatherby, in her view, had not taken sufficient care. He had also, she added, after a brief pause, been in a position to know rather more about the condition of the venture than he had shared with those he brought into it. Whether this was studied ignorance or ordinary carelessness was a question she had never been able to answer to her full satisfaction. Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Parks for the conversation and the coffee, returned to Miss Brent's final remarks with the warm interest they deserved, and walked home through the clear, cold morning with the feeling of a person who has placed the last significant piece of a picture and can now see the whole. Not the final piece. There were still things she did not know, and she was too experienced a thinker to mistake the feeling of coherence for the fact of completion. But the shape was now visible with a clarity that it had not possessed before. Douglas Weatherby had introduced people to Arthur Pell's venture. He had brought them in. He had known more than he had shared. And now he was living in the same village as the man who had organised the venture, and as at least one of the people he had introduced to it, and he had attended an evening arranged by a woman whose connection to the whole affair Miss Marple had not yet fully established, but was becoming increasingly confident about. She stopped at her own gate, and stood for a moment in the thin November air. It was, she realised, the first day of November, All Saints' Day, with its quiet suggestion of things past and things that required, perhaps, some form of acknowledgement. and thought about the hall lamp at Longridge House. She had been thinking about it, on and off, since it had first been mentioned. The lamp on the hall table, which ordinarily would have been extinguished when the guests departed, had been found still burning in the morning. No one recalled leaving it so. It was an oil lamp with a glass chimney slightly displaced, as she had herself observed on her first visit after the gathering. A lamp left burning through the night, in a house where all the guests had departed and the hostess had presumably retired, was either a lamp forgotten in the confusion of an unusual evening, or a lamp left deliberately as a signal, a marker, or a reminder of something that had occurred beneath it. She had not forgotten that the chimney was slightly displaced. Oil lamps, in her experience, did not displace their own chimneys. They were handled, or they were not. A chimney set back imprecisely was a chimney that had been removed and replaced in a moment when precision had not been the primary concern. She went inside and spent the morning in an activity that might, to a casual observer, have appeared to be nothing more than a thorough sorting of her correspondence drawer. In fact, it was something rather more purposeful. A careful review of the sequence of events as she now understood them, arranged in the order of their occurrence, with the gaps she could not yet fill marked plainly, so that she did not mistake the shape of her knowledge for the shape of the truth. The sequence, as she had it, was as follows. Mrs. Eleanor Finch had assembled a guest list with deliberate care, inviting 5 people who were connected in various ways and to various degrees, and to a failed property venture organised by Mr. Arthur Pell some years previously. Mr. Gerald Compton had been involved professionally. Mr. Douglas Weatherby had served as an intermediary, bringing investors in. Marion Compton had an older, quieter connection to Pell from their shared past. Mrs. Finch herself had some connection yet to be fully established. Miss Clara Holt's involvement remained unclear, and Miss Marple was not yet ready to assume that every guest's connection was of the same character. The house had been prepared with unusual care. The lamps had been lit before the curtains were drawn. A rear window had been found open in the back corridor. The supper had been civil and restrained. Mr. Pell had stepped outside at 10 o'clock. Mr. Weatherby had, at some earlier point in the evening, left the sitting room for 10 minutes or more, and Mr. Pell had been found the following morning beyond the orchard path, deceased. The cloakroom held a coat that had been placed with intention on the 3rd peg and never reclaimed. The garden bench had been turned to face the house. The bread knife had been set apart from the supper table. The hall lamp had burned through the night with its chimney slightly displaced. Miss Marple set down her pen and looked at the arrangement of facts with the quiet attention of a person reading a familiar piece of music and hearing, this time, the structure beneath the melody. The lamp was the detail she had been least certain about, and she was still not entirely certain. But she thought, and this was a thought she offered herself with deliberate tentativeness, that the lamp had been used, not for illumination in the ordinary sense. It was positioned in the hall, the point of arrival and departure, the place through which all the guests had passed. An oil lamp removed from its position and replaced imprecisely was a lamp that had been taken up in a hurry, or replaced in a hurry, by a person who needed it not as a household fixture but as a practical implement, a source of light in a moment when another source was not available or not desirable. She thought about the orchard path in the darkness of a late October night. She thought about what someone on that path or returning from it might have needed to examine closely before re-entering the house, or before replacing something in the cloakroom, or before ensuring that what had happened outside was not visible on whatever they brought back inside with them. She did not state the thought plainly, even to herself. It was not yet time for that. But she held it steadily and looked at it without flinching, which was, she had always found, the most honest thing one could do with an unwelcome possibility. She took up her pen again and wrote, in the margin of her notes, a single line. What does Eleanor Finch know, and how long has she known it? She had been approaching Mrs. Finch with the careful warmth of a woman paying considerate visits to a distressed neighbour, which was what the situation required and what she genuinely felt. But she was aware, and the awareness had been growing with each conversation, that Mrs. Finch was not simply a distressed neighbour. She was the architect of the evening. She'd written the guest list in a steady hand. She had lit the lamps before the curtains were drawn. She had opened her house to a group of people connected by a shared and unresolved grievance, and had placed them in a room together with the man at the centre of that grievance. Miss Marple put the cap on her pen and sat back in her chair. Tomorrow, she decided, she would visit Longridge House again, not as a neighbourly call precisely, though it would have all the outward qualities of one. She would go as a woman who had run out of patience with the gentle circumference of things and needed now to move a little closer to the centre. She would ask Mrs. Finch about her own connection to the property venture. She would ask it kindly and without any suggestion of accusation, but she would ask it directly, and she would wait, with all the calm and steadfast patience she possessed, for an honest answer. Outside, the November afternoon was settling into early dark. The elm trees at the field edge were bare now, and the garden had taken on the composed austerity of a space that had made its peace with the season. Miss Marple looked at it through the window, with a fondness that had nothing to do with beauty and everything to do with familiarity, and thought that October was over and November had begun, and that it was time, perhaps, for things that had been obscured to become a little clearer. She would not rush, she never did, but she would not either allow the clarity she had earned to wait any longer than necessary. Chapter 9. The name repeated in every account. Miss Marple arrived at Longridge House on Friday morning at 11 o'clock, which was a deliberate choice of hour. Too early carried the suggestion of urgency. Too late implied that she had spent the morning considering how to proceed, which was true but not the impression she wished to create. 11 o'clock was the hour of an ordinary visit, unhurried and without particular weight, and she carried with her a small bunch of late chrysanthemums from her own garden, which served the same function as the plum preserve had served on her first visit, a reason for coming that required no further explanation. Mrs. Finch received her in the sitting-room as before, and the fire was lit, and the chrysanthemums were placed in a vase with genuine pleasure. And tea was produced with the domestic competence that seemed to be Mrs. Finch's natural mode even in the midst of considerable difficulty. She looked, Miss Marple thought, somewhat less strained than on previous visits, which was not the same as saying she looked at ease. It was more the appearance of a woman who has reached a decision, and found that the decision, whatever its cost, has at least relieved her of the particular exhaustion of uncertainty. They spoke, for the first quarter of an hour, about the things one speaks about in such circumstances, the progression of the police inquiry, the response of the village, the small practical concerns that gather around any death, whether or not its cause is straightforward. Mrs. Finch was composed and clear on all of these matters, and answered each subject with the thoughtful economy of someone who has already considered it carefully. It was Miss Marple who brought the conversation to the point, and she did so with the directness she had decided upon the previous evening, gentle in manner as always, but without the slight sideways approach she had employed in earlier visits. "I wonder," she said, in the tone of someone raising a question that has been sitting patiently in the room for some time, "whether you would be willing to tell me about your own connection to Mr. Pell, not the connection of neighbours, which I understand perfectly well, but the earlier one." Mrs. Finch looked at her for a moment with the expression of a person who has been expecting a door to open, and is not entirely surprised to find that it has. Then she set down her cup, folded her hands in her lap with the deliberateness of someone setting aside one way of proceeding in favour of another, and said that, yes, she thought perhaps she would. She had known Arthur Pell, she said, for a very long time, longer than anyone in St. Mary Mead was aware. They had at one period more than 20 years ago been quite closely connected, a connection she described as significant and said no more about, beyond indicating that it had not ended in any formal or settled way, but had simply drawn apart as connections sometimes did, under the pressure of time and altered circumstances. She had not expected to encounter him again in any meaningful sense. When he had come to St. Mary Mead some years ago, she had found his presence in her own village, in a property no great distance from her own house, and something that required a period of private adjustment before she was able to treat it with the equanimity she eventually displayed. Mr. Pell had understood this. He was, as several people had observed, a man who understood a great deal and expressed very little. He had maintained in the years of their proximity a manner toward her that was perfectly correct and completely unintimate, which was at once a relief and, she admitted, a source of feeling she'd never quite identified satisfactorily. She had also known, through the gradual accumulation of knowledge that living in a small village provides, that Mr. Pell's past was not uncomplicated. She had heard from one source and another enough to understand the general outline of the property venture and the difficulties it had caused. She had known, more specifically, that Gerald Compton had a professional connection to those difficulties, and that Douglas Weatherby's role in the matter was one that bore examination. She had not known, until they had all come to live in St. Mary Mead, that the specific constellation of people involved included those who were now her neighbours. This had struck her, over time, as an arrangement that could not simply be left to continue in the politely ignoring way that village life sometimes managed such things. It was this, she said, that had prompted the gathering. Miss Marple asked very quietly what she had hoped the gathering would achieve. Mrs. Finch was silent for rather a long moment. Outside, the November garden presented its composed, minimal aspect, the last of the leaves down now and the beds put to rest for the winter. The fire shifted softly in the grate. "I am not entirely sure," she said at last. "I think I had thought that if I brought them all together, Arthur and the others and myself, something might be resolved, that things which had been left unspoken for a very long time might find a moment in which they could be spoken, or at least acknowledged. I have found over many years that unresolved things do not simply remain as they are, they accumulate. And I had felt for some time that what had accumulated among those particular people had reached a point that required attention. She had not, she said, anticipated what had occurred. She wished to be very clear about this, and she said it with the quiet intensity of a woman who understood that clarity on this particular point mattered very much. She had not foreseen harm. She had thought of something considerably more modest, an evening in which truths might surface, in which the long, careful fiction of mutual ignorance might be quietly retired. She had not thought beyond that. Miss Marple said that she believed her, and she meant it. She then said with the same gentle directness that she would like to ask about the accounts each guest had given of the evening. She had heard, from Inspector Slack and from her own conversations, that each person's recollection of Mr. Pell during the evening was notably similar, not merely consistent in the broad sense, but aligned in a way that went rather beyond the ordinary agreement of people who have shared the same evening. Mrs. Finch absorbed this without visible surprise. "The inspector noticed that as well," she said. "He did," said Miss Marple. "He used the word consistent, and I had the impression he was not entirely comfortable with it." "No," said Mrs. Finch, "I do not suppose he would be." She was quiet for a moment, and then said something that Miss Marple had been waiting, without quite knowing it, to hear. "We had spoken about it," she said, "not that evening, not at the supper, before. Gerald had said, and he was quite right, that whatever happened with the inquiry, it would be better if our accounts did not contradict one another in small ways. Not because there was anything to conceal, but because contradictions, even innocent ones, invite investigation in directions that are not always relevant." "Gerald said this," Miss Marple repeated with perfect neutrality. "He did. He is a solicitor. It was, I suppose, professional instinct. He was thinking of the group as a whole." She paused. "I do not think he was thinking of harm. I think he was thinking of the ordinary difficulties that arise when several people are questioned about the same event, and their accounts diverge in ways that suggest disorganization rather than dishonesty." Miss Marple considered this with the patient attention she gave to all things that had more than one face. It was, she reflected, a perfectly reasonable explanation for a thing that had struck her as deeply irregular. Reasonable explanations for irregular things were not, in her experience, necessarily innocent. but neither were they necessarily suspicious. A solicitor's instinct toward coherent narrative was entirely believable. The difficulty was that coherent narrative, however innocently motivated, could function as a kind of shelter, beneath which other things rested undisturbed. She asked, as the visit drew toward its natural close, whether Mrs. Finch had at any point during the evening been aware of Mr. Weatherby's absence from the sitting room. Mrs. Finch said that she had. He had left for a time, she thought perhaps 10 minutes, and had returned. She had not asked where he had been. It had not seemed the moment. Miss Marple nodded as though this confirmed something small and peripheral, which was precisely how she intended it to appear. She rose and collected her coat and thanked Mrs. Finch with genuine warmth for the tea and the conversation, and said that she hoped the coming days would be a little easier. Mrs. Finch saw her to the door and stood there for a moment as Miss Marple walked down the path, with the expression of a woman who has set something down after carrying it at some length, and is still learning what it feels like to stand without its weight. Walking home, Miss Marple passed the spot on the lane where the orchard wall was visible above the hedge line, and she looked at it for a moment without stopping. Each account of the evening had placed Mr. Pell in the sitting room, present and correct, at the same stage of the evening. Each account had noted his departure at the same time and in the same terms. Each account had noted that no one had followed him. But Marion Compton had seen Douglas Weatherby leave the room before Mr. Pell went outside, and a rear window had stood open in the back corridor, and a bench had been turned to face the house, and a coat had been placed on a cloakroom peg with intention and never recovered. The name repeated in every account was Mr. Pell's name, present, civil, unremarkable. A man made ordinary by the collective recollection of 5 people who had each, in their different ways, been waiting for the evening to reach some kind of conclusion. Miss Marple thought about the difference between a name that appeared in every account because a man had simply been there, and a name that appeared in every account because it was important, for reasons no one had stated, that he should appear to have been there in precisely the way described. She was nearly home before she identified, with the quiet satisfaction of a thing long sought and finally found, the remaining thread she needed to draw. It was not a dramatic thread. It was, in fact, rather a small one. But in her experience, it was very often the small threads that, when pulled, brought the rest of the fabric into resolution. She would speak with Inspector Slack in the morning. She thought she was ready to do so. Chapter 10. The Path That Led Only One Way. Inspector Slack came on Saturday morning at Miss Marple's invitation, and he came alone, which she had specifically requested in her note. He sat in the chair Mr. Compton had occupied a week earlier, and accepted tea without the air of practical necessity that had attended his first visit, which she took as a small but reliable indication that he was prepared to listen rather than merely to gather. She had arranged her thoughts with the care she gave to all things that were going to be said aloud to a person of consequence, and she began not with conclusions but with the sequence. The patient, orderly sequence that she'd been assembling since the evening after Mrs. Hartwell's first remark about a guest list written in a steady hand. She spoke for some time. Inspector Slack did not interrupt, which was, she felt, to his considerable credit. He made occasional notes in his notebook with the habitual efficiency of a man who had learned that writing things down was less a matter of memory than of respect for the person speaking and for the weight of what was being said. He looked at her steadily throughout with an expression she had not previously seen on his face, which was the expression of a man who is being told something he suspects is correct and is attending very carefully to the parts that will require him to act. She told him about the property venture and the constellation of people connected to it, who had found themselves, by various routes, in the same Oxfordshire village. She told him about Mr. Weatherby's role, not as a wronged investor, as he had presented himself, but as the intermediary who had drawn others in while holding knowledge he had not shared. She told him about Mr. Compton's prior professional involvement, and Marion Compton's older and more personal connection to Mr. Pell, and Mrs. Finch's own significant history with the man, unacknowledged in the village for years. She told him about Miss Holt, whose connection she had, by the end of her inquiries, established as that of a woman whose elderly mother had invested a modest sum in the venture on the strength of a recommendation from Douglas Weatherby, and had lost it entirely, a fact Miss Holt had never spoken of publicly, but had carried with the quiet, practical anger of a person who cannot afford to be seen as damaged by their circumstances. She told him then about the evening itself, the lamps lit with premature care, the rear window found open, Weatherby's absence from the sitting room for 10 minutes confirmed by 2 separate witnesses, the bench turned toward the house, the hall lamp with its displaced chimney, the bread knife set neatly aside, the coat placed on the 3rd cloakroom peg with the deliberate precision of a person who wished to leave behind as little as possible, and had, in one respect, failed. She paused at this point and allowed Inspector Slack to ask the question she could see forming in his expression. "The coat," he said. "You believe it was Weatherby's?" "I believe," Miss Marple said, with the measured care of a woman who understood the difference between belief and evidence, that the coat belonged to a man who had once been accustomed to quality and had subsequently managed on less, who took care of his appearance up to a point, but who had made small economies, a replaced button, a turned pocket, that he would not have made when his circumstances were more comfortable. Mr. Weatherby is precisely such a man. The coat's proportions, from what I observed, would also accord with a man of his build. I cannot say with certainty that it was his, but I think that if the question were put to him directly, and put without warning, his answer would be informative. Inspector Slack wrote something in his notebook. "He claims he left in his own coat," he said. "He does," said Miss Marple, "and perhaps he did. Though a man who left the sitting room for 10 minutes during the evening of a gathering, and who then required the use of a lamp from the hall table in the course of the night, for a purpose I will come to, and who returned to the house before the other guests departed, might have had occasion to change his outer garment and to leave one in a cloakroom where it might easily, in the confusion of the departing party, go unnoticed." She told him then about the path. Mr. Pell had gone outside at 10 o'clock. He had gone, she believed, not merely for air, and not without expectation of being met. A man who kept his equilibrium by knowing things about people, who had, in his quiet way, held a position of considerable knowledge relative to each person assembled in that room, was not a man who walked into the dark on a cold night without purpose. She thought he had been told, or had understood, that there was something to be resolved, a conversation perhaps, an acknowledgement, the kind of reckoning that Mrs. Finch had hoped the evening might produce, translated into a more private form. Douglas Weatherby had left the sitting room before Mr. Pell went outside. He had, she believed, gone to the rear of the house to the open corridor window, which commanded a view of the garden and the path along the boundary wall. He had used that window not to pass through, it was too small for that and too high from the garden, but to observe, to confirm that Pell was there, or to communicate something brief in the way that darkness and a raised window permit. And then he had gone out, not through the front of the house, where his departure might have been remarked upon, but through a service door that opened onto the kitchen passage, and from there into the side path, and around to the orchard boundary by the outer lane, through the unlocked gate she had herself examined. The footprints along the path, 2 clear sets, and a possible third, were consistent with this. Mr. Pell's outward movement and someone approaching from the far gate, not impulsively, not in anger in the dramatic sense, but with a settled, quiet certainty that had been forming, she thought, for some considerable time. What had passed between them on the path she could not say with precision. She did not believe it had been a long encounter. The bread knife, which had been taken from the supper table at some point during the evening and set aside with a neatness that indicated planning rather than impulse, had been used and had not been recovered. The hall lamp, she believed, had been taken up by Weatherby upon re-entering the house through the cloakroom side passage to examine himself before returning to the sitting room, a matter of a few minutes, in the course of which the chimney had been removed and replaced without perfect attention. She finished and set down her teacup and looked at Inspector Slack with the composed expression of a woman who has said what she came to say, and is content to leave the rest to those whose business it is. Inspector Slack was quiet for a moment that was, by his standards, quite long. Then he said, with the flatness of a man selecting the most useful of many possible responses, "The knife has not been found." "No," said Miss Marple, "I would look in the section of the outer lane between the far gate and the point where it joins the main road. It is overhung on both sides, and the ground there is soft. A thing pressed into the ground in the dark in haste would not necessarily surface immediately." Inspector Slack wrote this down. He also wrote down several other things, without offering commentary on them, which Miss Marple considered the most productive response he could have made. He asked before he left what she believed should be done about the other guests, about the coherent accounts, and the knowledge each had carried, and the silence each had kept. Miss Marple considered this with genuine care. It was, she thought, the most important question he had asked all morning, and she did not wish to answer it hastily. "I think," she said at last, "that there are different kinds of complicity, and that the law and ordinary human understanding do not always reach the same conclusions about them. Mrs. Finch assembled those people with the intention of resolving something, not of enabling harm. Mr. Compton arranged for consistent accounts from professional instinct, and a perhaps imperfect understanding of where his obligations lay. Mrs. Compton attended because she felt she should, and said less than she knew to an inspector whose questions did not make room for texture. Miss Holt held back a detail, and then offered it when she understood its weight. None of them witnessed what occurred. None of them, I am reasonably certain, knew in advance that it would occur. She paused. What they knew afterward was enough to keep them silent, and that is a different matter, and one I suspect you're better placed to assess than I am. Inspector Slack said that he would look into it. He said it in the manner of a man who had already, in the course of the last hour, begun to understand that looking into it would require a different quality of attention than he had thus far applied to the case. He left at 12:30, walking with the purposeful step of a man who has more to do than he had expected when he arrived. Miss Marple sat for a while in the quiet of her sitting room after he had gone, with the small, still feeling that followed the completion of a thing that had required sustained effort. Outside, the November morning was clear and very cold, the garden laid out in its winter simplicity, the sky a pale and lucid blue. She thought of Arthur Pell, the man at the centre of it all, the man whose name had appeared in every account, whose presence had structured an entire evening, whose past had reached forward through many years to find him on an orchard path in the dark. She thought of him without particular judgment, which was the most honest response she could manage. He had not been a good man in the complete sense, but she had known very few people who were good in the complete sense, and she did not think incomplete goodness was a sufficient reason for what had happened to him. She thought of Mrs. Finch, who had wanted resolution, and had received something very different, and would carry that for the rest of her life. She thought of Douglas Weatherby, smooth and presentable, and, at the centre of him, a man who had for many years made small decisions that favoured his own comfort over other people's welfare, until the accumulation of those decisions had